Hi, my name is Ginny Wind, and I want to tell you a little bit about myself. I was born and raised here in San Antonio. I graduated from Jefferson High School, and I went to the University of Texas in San Antonio. In Austin. I said San Antonio. I have two kids. Both graduated from Health Careers High School. Both went to UT Austin, and my son is now a paramedic in the San Antonio area. My mother was a survivor. What does a survivor mean? It means that during World War II, she was put into a camp. She managed to survive all the atrocities that was thrown at her. That makes me a second-generation survivor. And I'm here to tell you my mom's story. In some ways, my mom is similar to Anne Frank. How's that? They both were the same age. My mother was 9 months older than Anne Frank. My mother was born September 15th, 1928. Anne Frank was born June 12th, 1929. They also had the same name. My mother's name was Anne Levitt. The differences are, my mother is from Eastern Europe, and Anne Frank was from Western Europe. That means that, in a sense, they sort of had a different experience of timing of when they got involved with the war. They also had a different experience of what happened to them throughout the war. Anne Frank went into hiding. My mother never went into hiding. My mother was from Poland, a small town called Wyszków. It's about an hour away from Warsaw. She came from an immediate family of about 5 kids. She had one older sister, one older brother, and 2 younger brothers. In her extended family, she had lots of aunts and uncles, about 9 aunts and uncles. 3 of them lived in the United States, and 1 lived in Mexico. 6 lived in Poland. In Poland, she did not live in the same city as her aunts and her uncles. Now, before the war began, there was a lot of anti-Semitism in Poland. And what is anti-Semitism? It's when you are against one group of people and you do acts that aren't exactly nice to them. In a sense, you are big bullies. So in 1937, my grandparents figured out that it's time for them to get out of Poland. So they decided to get their eldest daughter out first. They sent her to Mexico because, remember, there are aunts and uncles there. And my aunt was 18 years old at the time. My mother was only 9 years old. She was in 4th grade. She went to public school in Poland. And the family planned on somehow following later on. In order to leave a country, you had to have visas. And a visa was a paper that was issued from a country that you wanted to go to. And in order to get these visas, you had to have money and you had to have a sponsor. So there had to be people in the country where you wanted to go that was willing to sponsor you. You also had to meet the quota. Every country had a quota. How many people from, like the United States, let's say, would say, we can take so many people from Poland, so many people from Austria. And that's how many visas they gave out. My aunt ended up leaving on a fictional marriage. They set her up as a fake marriage in order to get her out of the country because she could not get a visa, but she could as a bride. Okay, 1939, September 1st, that is when World War II began in Europe. Warsaw was one of the first cities to be hit, as well as my mother's town. At the time, my family was not in the city. They were actually out in a farm. My great-grandfather had a farm. So they were out visiting. School had not quite started yet, and they weren't there with the bombing. My grandfather returned to the city to see what, was anything left. And he saw that the city had been destroyed and their house had been destroyed. So from the very, very first day of World War II, my mother was homeless. She had no home to go back to. So aside from that, the Germans were already there. So they decided to go kind of northeast toward Vilna, which is now called Vilnius. Vilna at the time was in Lithuania. It was not in Poland. It was not in Russia. They thought that it would be easier if they go to Vilna, they could maybe get into Russia and escape that way. Besides that, my grandmother had one of her brothers there. Well, they arrived on a Friday with basically whatever they had on their back. And the border to Lithuania, I should say Lithuania closed its borders on Sunday. So now they're trapped in Vilna, Lithuania. The conditions there were very, very crowded because they weren't the only people who thought this would be a good way to get out of Poland. There were lots and lots of refugees. So at the beginning, they shared an apartment with their aunt and uncle, who also had 2 children. Their oldest daughter, of the aunt and uncle, was supposed to start medical school. The younger one was about my mother's age. Eventually, my grandparents found another apartment, and the children started school. They were this time not in a public school, but a Jewish school. And this is now they were there for 1 year till 1940. And my mother and her 2 brothers, or her 3 brothers, they had to take a test in order to get into high school. It's not like here where you go middle school and then high school automatically. There you have to take a test and get accepted. And at age 12, my mother was accepted to go into high school or gymnasia with her brothers. In the meantime, my grandfather was trying to get visas through Shanghai. Why Shanghai? Well, the Japanese vice consul who worked for the Japanese consulate, he was preparing visas to get the Jews out of Lithuania, out of Vilna. And they were illegal visas. They were forged. And while he ended up saving, this gentleman saved 2,139 lives. That's how many visas he actually gave out before he had to quit. By the time the visa came for my grandparents, my grandparents, my mother, and her brothers, it was too late. The Germans had already come in. It's June 1941 now. My mother is almost 13. Immediately after the Germans came in, they started racial laws. What are racial laws? Racial laws are laws that they say that the Germans put out that would tell you what you can do, what you cannot do. Basically, Jews are not allowed to walk on the sidewalk. They have to walk in the street. Jews have to wear a star. And at all given times, you have to see a Star of David on their clothes. So they're given stars. And they're told to sew them onto their clothes. There were certain businesses you cannot go into. If you had a business, you couldn't run the business anymore. It was taken over by Germans. The other thing that happened almost immediately is that you needed to get permits from the Germans. What do these permits mean? It's your way of survival. It means that you could go and get food, that you're not going to get rounded up. You only get these permits by working. And when I say rounded up, if you're walking down the street and the Germans just decide we're going to round up, literally, people, and you're there, if you have a permit, they might let you go. But if you don't have a permit, you're being taken away, rounded up to be taken away. So right before September 1st, 1941, there was a rumor that there was going to be a ghetto. Okay, let's say, what is a ghetto? Let's say we took the area around the school and we said, everyone who is blonde and blue-eyed has to live in this area. And you put a fence around it and barbed wire around it, and it's you, your families, it's everyone. It's super crowded. You cannot leave the area. You cannot have people come visit you. You are stuck in this area. That is a ghetto. And they were going to put the Jews in this area of town, which they designated that was going to be the ghetto. At the time, September 1st, my grandfather went to get a permit to work. You have to get them every so often to renew it. And he was walking on the sidewalk with a Polish friend. My grandfather was blonde and blue-eyed. He did not look Jewish. He did not look Polish. He did not look like he should have been caught. He could have been German. But he did not and he didn't have his star on. He had it on his jacket, which he had over his arm. Well, they walked right into a roundup, and the German soldier looked at my grandfather's jacket, saw he was Jewish, saw he did not have a current permit, so he was led away with the others. And he was taken to a place called Ponar. And Ponar was a mass grave. It's in the forest. And at that single day that my grandfather was killed, there were 10,000 other Jewish people killed that were rounded up. My grandfather died on a Monday. The Jews entered the ghetto on a Friday. That's say Monday, the end of the week. My grandmother did not have any time to mourn, or my mother. They entered the ghetto by themselves, without their father, without her husband. And now you got to remember, my mother is all of 12 years old. She's not quite 15, because this is a week before her, 13. It's a week before her birthday. So once again, they are in the ghetto, and they're living in a crowded apartment with another family. And there's 8 people in one bedroom, in a one-bedroom apartment. My grandmother with her 4 children, and another lady with her 2 children. My mother, at age, let's say 13, had to go to work. She went to work with my grandmother on the railroad. I don't know where her older brother worked. The 2 younger brothers, they used to sneak out of the ghetto to take things out so they could buy food, to bring food back in. And they were always at risk of a roundup. And my grandmother and my mother, they never knew when they came back to the apartment whether the 2 little ones would be there or not. Then in 1943, my mother is almost 15 years old, they were going to liquidate the ghetto. What does liquidate the ghetto mean? It means clean it out. Now nobody's going to live there. They're going to put the Jewish people who live in the ghetto, take them in somewhere else. So on the day that they did that, they lined Germans up on both sides of the road so people couldn't escape. There were German shepherds with the Germans, and they were led to the railroad station. At that time, they were put into 2 groups, men and women. And once again, they were divided up. Life or death, left or right. Right meant life, left meant death. The reason being, it depended which train you went on, where you were going. At the time, my mom and my grandmother saw my grandmother's sister-in-law, my mom's aunt, with that one daughter who was supposed to go to medical school. They were in front of them. They also saw that the son was on the left, going to death. At the time, though, they didn't realize, when they were in that line, what was meant by the division of which way you went. But they saw that the son was on the other side. Now, my mom's uncle, my grandmother's brother, he also had been shot in the Ponar forest right after my grandfather was shot. So when my mother and my grandmother had their turn to decide who was going to go left, who was going to go right, my mother and grandmother were standing in front of Himmler himself, who was a big I guess, leader of the German movement, the Nazi movement at the time. My grandmother was told to go right, to go to work, to go to live. And my mother never waited to hear what side they told her to go. She just ran after her mother. At that point, they were put on a train for 3 days and 3 nights, and they arrived at a camp called Kaiser Vault. It's not a death camp. It was a work camp. And when they were going to be decided what kind of work they were going to do, there was an SS soldier, commander, named Eichwalder. And he was in charge of a factory that made German uniforms. And these uniforms were supposed to go to the Eastern Front to go fight, to send to the soldiers to go fight the Russians. The factory was in the town of Riga. It was not in the camp itself. So Eichfelder did not want the women that he selected to work on his uniforms to look like they were in a camp. So he insisted that they didn't have their head shaved and they could keep their clothes. They didn't have to go into camp uniforms. So in working with him, they also ended up getting more food. So every day, they would be marched out of the camp to the factory, then back to the camp. One day, the Germans decided to take this group of women and move them to another camp. This one was called Stutthof, which is an extermination camp or a death camp. And the same German SS commander, Eichfelder, he went to Kaiser Vault, saw his women weren't there, found out where they went, followed them to Stutthof and said to the commandant of the camp, listen, I need my women. I don't want to train any other women. I want this group of women. I want them to continue working on those German uniforms. They're helping, the Reich, the Nazis. So Eichfelder got his women once again, and once again, they didn't have to have their head shaved. They didn't have to wear the uniforms. While they were at Stutthof, my mother was interned in Stutthof, there was a typhus outbreak, and Eichfelder convinced the commandant of the camp that he needed his women healthy. So he brought the women back into the factory, and they now did not sleep in the camp. They slept actually on the German army uniforms instead, and so they were able not to get typhus. Now, the interesting thing, what these women did, their way of kind of getting back at the Germans, getting back at the Nazis, was that they would kind of do things to the uniforms. Like if they were sewing the lining of the jacket, well, they would kind of sew the lining together so the German would try to put their sleeve through, their hand through the sleeve. They couldn't. It was sewn together. They would do loose stitches, so if the jacket would kind of fall apart. They would tie the boots together, pack them. So they would do 2 left boots, 2 right boots. So some German on the Eastern Front would not get a complete uniform. So that was their way of kind of getting even with the Germans. Well, one day, this group of women did not show up to work. They were already back at the camp. They didn't show up to work, so Eichfelder decided he needs to go find out what happened to him. So he goes to the commandant. And they were this group of women were already lined up to go into the gas chamber. They went in the gas chamber, and they were waiting for the gas to come out. And Eichfelder had the commandant of the camp stop it and pull him out because, once again, he needed him for the war effort. So my mother was pulled out with her mother from the gas chamber. As the front, the Russians, the front was moving closer. The Germans started to want to move their prisoners away so they would not be caught with all these prisoners. They wanted to take them with them. When I say front, I mean like when the Russians were moving in on the Germans. They had the upper hand, and they were pushing them back. So this is the end of April of 1945, and that's when they started to move the people out of the camp. My mother was on one of the last of the death marches. What is a death march? A death march is when they try to move all the prisoners, and these prisoners are weak. They haven't eaten. They're getting, when I say meager portions, they're getting like soup with maybe a rotten potato in it. Soup. It's not even soup. It's, warm water. That's really gross. They have been beaten. They've been working. Have had typhus. At this point, my mother already had typhus. So they're kind of weak, and they're told, now you have to walk many, many miles. And I don't know exactly how many miles my mother had to walk, but the idea was to get them closer to Germany. So they walked him. The Stutthof was next to the Baltic Sea, or close to the Baltic Sea, and which is the north of Poland. And they walked him to the Baltic. They made it through. Many times my mother was like pulling my grandmother along. And they got to the Baltic, and there were barges. And the plan was to take these prisoners to a town called Lübeck, Germany. Well, they had to wade through water to get to the barge. Well, my grandmother and my mother didn't know how to swim. My grandmother went ahead, got on the barge. My mother refused to get into the water. So my grandmother's like saying, come on, you gotta come. My mother's going, no. So my grandmother gets off of the barge, comes back to the shore to my mother, and as soon as she did that, the Allies started bombing the area. And as soon as they started bombing the area, the Germans abandoned the barges, and when they abandoned, they started shooting killing everybody who was on the barge that my grandmother had just gotten off of. The ones that were still on the shore, they lined them up, and they randomly shot some of them, and then they started marching them to a German naval camp called Neustadt. And that's where my mother ended up. May 3rd, 1945, she was liberated by the British. The war was officially over a few days later. My mother was 16 years old. So actually, my mother saw the beginning of the war and the end of the war. She stayed in Neustadt until the end of 1946. Then she went to Paris to a DP camp. And from there, she left for the United States. In 1947, they were reunited with my aunt, who lived in Mexico, my grandmother's daughter and my mom's sister, and some other aunts and uncles. So one more thing. How were Anne Frank and my mother similar? They both had typhus. I can honestly tell you, I know what Anne Frank wrote in her diary, and I know what my mother used to say, but they both believed that in spite of all the evil, that there is also good. My mother used to talk to kids just like you and tell them that it is up to us to not bully, to not hate, to not be mean to other people, because that leads to worse things. It's like a snowball that's going down a mountain, and it gets bigger and bigger. We may not like everyone. We may not like everything everyone does, but we should tolerate and learn to live together. Another similarity that they had, both of them had people who helped them. My mother had the German SS soldier, Eichfelder, and Anne Frank had the people, her father's workers, who hid them in the annex until they were discovered. There are other things.
Genesis Gillard up to the front office. Genesis Gillard up to the front office.
There's other things that I know that was in, because I did talk to my mother a lot about the diary of Anne Frank. There's a quote from the Diary of Anne Frank that says, "How wonderful it is that nobody need wait a single moment before starting to improve the world." Another quote, in spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. Well, my mother taught me not to hate, not to judge people. And that would be her message if she was here today for all of you, to not to hate, not to judge people, not to bully. That's my mom's story. Are there any questions from anybody?
How long did they have to stand together?
That's a good question. Let me see if I have it in here. They went into the ghetto, let's see, 1941. And they went out of the ghetto, 1943, so 2 years in the ghetto, about. Anyone else? Yes.
Was your mom Jewish?
Yes. Yes. I mean, their only crime was that they were Jewish. The girl in the pink, well, you both have kind of pink. The one with the stripes.
After the war, what happened to your grandmother?
My grandmother survived, obviously, with my mother. And she split her time between living with her daughter in Mexico and living with my mother here in San Antonio. So she kind of lived with me 6 months out of the year. Yes.
So you said your mother worked with this from 9 to 16?
Yes. The one in the back.
How did your mom find out about your grandfather's death?
About how did my mother find out about what?
Your grandfather's death?
Your father's death.
Oh, about her father's death? She actually went around looking and asking people, and she found out that he was rounded up. And she found out that he was taken to the forest and what was happening in the forest. Yes.
What about the son? You said how they split the girls and the boys. What happened to the son?
He was killed. He went to another camp where he was gassed or exterminated or something immediately. The mother went to the left, and the daughter went to the right and ended up at the same camps as my mother. And very much like Anne Frank was in Buchenwald, another camp. And I think a few days before, very close to liberation, she actually died of typhus. Well, my mom's cousin, the same thing, the one that was supposed to go to medical school, the same thing happened to her. She had typhus, and very shortly, she did not go on the death march. She ended up dying of typhus at the camp in Stutthof. Yes?
What is typhus exactly?
It's something you get from like fleas, from dirt, from living under dirty conditions, filth. Yes?
Do you ever think that the commander
I filled her.
do you think that he actually felt bad for the Jews who did this job, so he tried to help them?
That's a good question. I mean, obviously he was older than my mother, so he's probably already deceased. I can't find him. And my mother never tried to make contact with him. And you got to remember, back then there were no computers and, internet to be able to really go and look for someone that easily. I don't know if his purpose was because he felt sorry for the Jewish people or whether he really just wanted to use them for the war effort. And he really didn't want to train another group every few weeks. I don't know. But I would like to believe that he felt something good for the people. Any more? Ready? That's it? Okay. Well, thank you.